So who you see pictured here are William McIntosh, who was a Creek Miko, or chief, and his friend and political ally, Etome Tustenagi. McIntosh was executed in May of 1825 when 150 Creek warriors from the Upper Creek tribes, led by a chief named Manawa, surrounded his plantation and set it on fire. The fire forced out McIntosh's wives. He had 2 wives, and his children. They were forced to strip down, or at least partially strip, which was a form of humiliation, and watch the destruction of the plantation. McIntosh and Etome were inside the plantation house for as long as they could, and they were trying to fight back and fire at the attackers, but they eventually were forced out due to the fire. And Etome was shot as he left the front door, and McIntosh was captured by one of the Creek warriors, who then took a large dagger and stabbed him through the chest, killing him. From the attackers' perspective, the Upper Creek attackers, they believed that this was the accomplishment of justice. McIntosh was a Lower Creek chief who had at first been on the side of trying to keep white people out, but after a few years decided to go down another path. He was one of the success stories of the Civilization Project. He adopted a lot of American ways, which included running a plantation complete with slaves and producing agricultural goods for the market. McIntosh, by 1825, was more open to working with Americans against the laws of the Creek Nation, who had decided in 1821 in the Creek National Council that any Creek who sold land without the approval of the council to any white people would be subject to the death penalty. This was to try to preserve as much homeland as they could. So McIntosh actually agreed with that in 1821. By 1825, he was less enthusiastic about that. He was encouraged by a bribe of $40,000, which at that time was a lot of money. $40,000 in 1825 would be something like $5 or $6 million today. That convinced him to get together with some other of his Creek allies and sign a treaty called the Treaty of Indian Springs in 1825, February of 1825. And most of the Indian Springs treaty lands were this middle peach color here. And so McIntosh's plantation was on the Chattahoochee River, right about there. And he sold hundreds of thousands of acres to the United States for them to settle. The Creeks considered this illegal and that he had violated the law that they had passed earlier that decade, and thus he was subject to the death penalty, and Manawa was the person who carried that out. McIntosh and Etome were not the only victims. 2 of McIntosh's son-in-laws who were involved in the treaty were also found and executed. So this illustrated the conflict that a lot of tribes went through as the United States was growing more and more powerful and spreading westward more and more quickly. So some natives believed that it was necessary for them to accept reality and take as much money as they could from Americans, get them to pay them as much as possible for their land, and then move somewhere away from where Americans were. Other natives believed that they should try to hold on to their homelands at any cost and not allow Americans to overrun them. The most famous tribes that tried to resist this movement to remove native communities east of the Mississippi were the Cherokees. The Creeks were one of them, Choctaws, others, but the Cherokee were by far the most famous. So the situation of the Cherokee and all the lower southeast Muskogean tribes, so what the Americans by this time, by the 1820s, were calling the 5 civilized tribes. And their situation was they were called civilized because most of them had picked up English by this point, at least had a certain percentage of their population that spoke pretty decent English. A lot of them had accepted to one degree or another the Civilization Project. So the Civilization Project, what the goal of it was started in the Thomas Jefferson years in the early 1800s, the 1800s. The goal for Native Americans was to Christianize them and incorporate them into the United States as residents of the U.S. And there were a series of laws passed during the early years of the United States Republic. One of them was called the Indian Intercourse Acts, and those were laws that facilitated and funded projects led mostly by ministers to go and engage in missionary activity among the natives. So that had some success. The success was mixed of that initiative, but the Cherokee had gone pretty far in incorporating enough of that to ingratiate themselves with some Americans. So the Cherokee went further, was that they ingratiated themselves with Americans politically. And a way that they did that was adopted a constitution and declared themselves a nation. Many of the eastern tribes started calling themselves nations, so they understood that the Americans responded to that, and they thought it gave them some legal backing. The Cherokee went the furthest in this, in declaring themselves a nation, and also declaring themselves to have a constitution with very specific rights and privileges, and in no certain terms, sovereignty over their lands. And so the Cherokee claimed all this territory that's now Tennessee, Kentucky, parts of Georgia and the Carolinas, and a little bit of Alabama. The Creeks were here in Alabama and Georgia, Choctaws in what's now Mississippi, Chickasaws in Mississippi, Tennessee, the western part of it. The Cherokee had adopted this constitution. They, many of them learned English. They transliterated their language into the writing so that you could translate English to Cherokee and Cherokee to English through writing. They had a newspaper. They started operating plantations, and so they had a thriving economy. And they did everything they thought they needed to do to protect themselves legally. And as a result of engaging in at least parts of the Civilization Project, they had allies in the American government who looked at the Cherokee and said, this is the example of exactly what we want to accomplish. Now, the civilization policy had been the goal of the first couple, 2 or 3 presidents of the United States and the early governments. By the 1820s, there was more of a movement that was pushing back against this. A lot of Americans argued the Civilization Project wasn't working well enough, that the people were still uncivilized, the natives were still uncivilized, they were not obeying the rules that Americans set down for them, they weren't fully converting to Christianity, and so forth. And one of the people who complained about the Civilization Project the most was Andrew Jackson. Jackson, for much of his life, had been a notorious Indian fighter. He participated in the suppression of the Red Stick Creek Rebellion, which we talked about earlier, and he also fought in the Seminole Wars in late 18-teens, 1820s, which were part of the conflicts that led to the U.S. Acquiring Florida. Jackson had several problems with civilization policy. One, he did not think the natives could become quote-unquote civilized. He thought they would never fully integrate with white Americans. He did not believe that treaties made with natives were anything that Americans needed to respect because, in his words, you cannot make a treaty with a savage. And so any agreements, written agreements, Jackson felt were not legitimate with Native American nations or communities. Jackson also was very nationalist. He wanted the United States to continue Manifest Destiny, spreading the continent, and that very much meant infilling the interior of the continent, or the interior of the American territory, which was a lot of this area east of the Mississippi. The U.S. had acquired the Louisiana Territory, but it hadn't even taken full possession of a lot of its existing territory that it had held since the end of the American Revolution. And Jackson wanted to occupy that. He wanted Americans to have that land and to prosper from those lands' resources. He didn't feel that natives had any title to it. He also believed that because natives and white people were so different, he did not think they could ever get along or live together, and so he felt the best thing for the natives was to move them somewhere that they wouldn't bother white people, and that would save them in the process. And so this is a cartoon portraying him as a patriarchal father figure to the natives. And he did see his politics as being humanitarian. He thought that if they continued the civilization project approach or continued the treaty approach, all that would mean was that white people would eventually just go in and destroy the natives. They would go in and kill them because you can't control them or can't control people, and there's going to be fighting, and the local settlers will eventually kill the natives. Jackson thought to save the natives, we have to get them out. That was pretty much a big part of his whole political identity. Indian removal was what he most wanted to accomplish. So in 1830, Jackson did succeed after he was elected president in 1828. In 1830, he did succeed in passing what was called the Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act said that the natives east of the Mississippi were going to have to be removed to west of the Mississippi to what was called Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma and parts of Kansas. The Cherokee fought this legally. The Cherokee argued, we have agreements in place with the United States. We should not have to just leave our homelands because there's been a change in administration with different political attitudes towards us. So the natives took their opposition to the Indian Removal Act all the way to the Supreme Court. What the Cherokee argued was that this could not count. The Indian Removal Act did not apply to them because they had previous agreements with the United States that superseded this law and that were binding.